Antarctic and Siberian ice core samples are the only hard evidence we have in understanding the relationship between carbon dioxide, CO2, and global temperature. Everything else is conjecture and laughably simplified computer models of climate that have now proven their absolute lack of predictive accuracy. I believe that climate change skepticism is a result of objectively analyzing the hard evidence that underpins this whole debate. Let's look at the evidence. 1. The Antarctic and other ice core samples allow us to track both atmospheric CO2 levels and temperature for at least the past 800,000 plus years. In fact, those ice cores are the only real scientific evidence in this debate, evidence that is untainted by selection bias or changes in the location, distribution, and accuracy of measurement technology since humans began to track temperature. Those ice core samples show that factors other than CO2 level have driven periods of extreme global warming and cooling with no contribution from humans. Don't we have to assume that those factors, solar activity, orbital variations, etc., are still at play and that we are likely in a natural warming or cooling trend now, as we have always been? 2. Over the past 800,000 years, every warming period started when CO2 was at an historic low and every cooling period started when CO2 was at an historic high. If CO2 were a greenhouse gas, would we not expect the opposite to be the case? In a laboratory setting or in a simplistic computer model of climate, then perhaps CO2 could be a theoretical greenhouse gas, but hard empirical evidence of how CO2 affects temperature on this complex planet shows that CO2 is irrelevant to temperature. And if that is the case, the whole argument that man-made CO2 is warming the planet is likely wrong, and all steps to curb CO2 emissions will have no effect on global temperature. 3. The ice core samples also clearly show that, in every warming period, global temperature always rose 200 to 1,000 years before CO2 levels, and the inverse in every cooling period. Since cause must always come before effect, then the evidence shows that temperature change is the cause and CO2 level is the effect. If we accept that solar variability is the cause of the past 800,000 years of global warming and cooling, then the most plausible explanation of the delayed rise in CO2 levels is that a warmer planet caused CO2 to gradually come out of solution in the oceans and into the atmosphere, and a cooling planet causes the oceans to gradually reabsorb that CO2. That strikes me as a more reasonable explanation for the cause and effect relationship between CO2 and temperature than being forced to believe that cause can come after effect. 4. There is the argument used by those who believe in man-made climate change that CO2 does not cause global warming, but that it amplifies external forcings. Again, the hard evidence does not support that hypothesis. If CO2 were an amplifier of global warming, then a warming planet caused by solar variations would drive more CO2 from the oceans into the atmosphere, and we would see a positive feedback loop with runaway warming. Yet that has never happened. Every warming period has given birth to a cooling period and every cooling period has given birth to a warming period. That would seem to debunk the theory that CO2 is an amplifier of external warming forces. 5. On a practical observational level, I have a cottage on a lake north of Toronto. A few seconds ago in geologic time, that place, and most of Canada and Europe, were buried under kilometers of ice that extended to the North Pole. Yet around 12,000 years ago, rapid and extreme global warming caused that massive sheet of ice to melt and become the tiny dot that is today's Arctic ice sheet. And all that happened in the blink of a geologist's eye and all without the help of humans. 6. Assuming we are in a natural warming or cooling period, as we always have been on this planet, then why waste resources, brain power, and time at war with CO2, a natural and harmless gas that supports all green life on this planet? Why not apply those resources to dealing with rising or falling ocean levels and lengthening or shortening growing seasons? In other words, we should adapt to natural changes over which we have no control, rather than pretending we can control global temperature and dissipating our resources chasing an imaginary villain.